Hi, everyone. You can see my name, Gabriella Coleman. I am a member of the Tor board, and I'm here to moderate today's Priv chat. It's a very special day. It is the 25th quarter of a century silver jubilee of Tor, a Torific day, you might even say. And with no further ado, what I'm going to do is introduce our three guests who are very central and important to the founding of Tor. And I will introduce each one of them, and then we'll proceed with the chat. So let's start with Paul Syverson. Paul Syverson. He is the inventor of onion routing, creator of Tor, author of one book and over 100 refereed papers, chair of many security and privacy conferences, and an aspiring unicycle commuter. There's a lot more that he's done, but I do want to mention one very important thing to today's chat. He's the founder of the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Symposium, a kind of community that has been very central to Tor. So next up is Nick Mathewson. There he is. He's also one of the original designers of Tor and is an expert in implementing anonymity technologies. He began volunteering to program Tor in 2002, became the principal developer in 2007, and became the lead software architect in 2012. He was instrumental in writing Tor's comprehensive protocol specifications, which have enabled researchers to base their work on solid foundation and have enabled multiple independent implementations of the Tor protocols. And third up is Roger Dingledine. There he is. So he is the president and co-founder of the Tor Project, which is a nonprofit and open source software to protect people from tracking, censorship, and surveillance online. He works with journalists and activists on many continents to help them understand and defend against threats they face. He has also done many, many things, but I think we are here to hear from them and hear a little bit about how this whole Tor business came into being. And so actually to start, before there was Tor, there was maybe a commitment to anonymity. And so it would be really great if each one of you, and we'll start with Paul, could tell us a little bit about your background and why anonymity is something important to you, and when you first realized, hey, this is something that I am not only committed to, but I actually want to build tools to kind of help enable.
Hi. Well, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so my background, most of my graduate degrees are actually in philosophy, but I have a master's in math, so that's my job title, mathematician. When I came to NRL in the late 80s, I was mostly working on logic, which is my academic background, to look at authentication protocols. So you would have rules like if Alice sees a message encrypted with K and Alice believes that K is a good key for talking with Bob, then Alice will believe that at some point in the past Bob said that message. And then you have other rules to see if he said it recently and things like that. So that's the sort of thing that I had started on when I started my job forever ago. Anonymity is a big topic. I guess I would say try to sum up maybe three quick things. One, as an analytic philosopher by training, it's a very interesting concept because it's hard to get right, especially for like low latency anonymous communication. There's other systems that people have designed that are theoretically secure, and it's easy to sort of give formal definitions for those. But we created onion routing with an interest to be practical, and as such, it wasn't as amenable to rigorous definitions, and it took us well over a decade to sort of get that all worked out. That's sort of the academic interest. In terms of importance, I just think anonymity is, fundamentally important. Amongst other things, it's central to the founding in the United States. The Constitution owes a lot of its structure to the fact that the Federalist Papers were published anonymously, and that had a lot to do with their acceptance and their uptake So it's just fundamentally important, both on the sort of, that's the sort of producing, sending end, but also on the receiving end, just the ability to, go buy a newspaper with cash and read it privately. The last thing I would note, though, is that despite all that, I think it can be a little misleading to focus just on anonymity, especially with respect to onion routing. I think of it more as about autonomy. So in one of our early papers, we even said that our goal isn't anonymous communication per se, but to separate identification from routing. So you might want to log in and authenticate yourself to the people at the other end, but you don't want the infrastructure to have to know who's talking to whom just because the bits are moving around. So I would say in some sense it's more about autonomy. You get to control who gets to see things, and you also get to control what you know. Usually when you communicate with a site, you have no idea where your bits are going. But with Tor, you not only know, but have it authenticated where the path that your traffic is taken. So
That's a great point. Tor often gets identified with anonymity. I opened with that question, but there's a lot more to the technology. Roger, you want to take a little stab at that question?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Paul said, and I'll add a couple of more things that add to it. The first piece is reiterating the giving people control side. So one of the most important things about Tor and onion routing from my perspective is the goal is people who are using Tor get to choose what people learn about them. So it isn't I'm going to Facebook and by default it learns where I am as well as whatever I say once I log in. When you're using Tor, you can choose whether to go to Facebook and you can choose what Facebook is to learn about you. So that control is one of the key parts. Another angle to look at that is I'm really interested in power imbalances. So right now there are huge governments around the world and huge companies around the world who are doing great. They've got a lot of power in the world, whereas individuals in a lot of different situations don't have that balance. So so these things build on each other. Giving people control over who gets to learn about them helps to address those power imbalances. And then the third piece of it is the community side. Personally, the thing that I find most exciting and rewarding about this is going to meet people around the world whose lives are changed because of our security tools and learning about what's going on in their world and how different places around the world are different.
So Nick, when you reflect on this, can you take us a little bit back 25 years? I mean, when you were thinking about autonomy, anonymity online, right? So there's today, and clearly like Tor is more important than ever because of the power imbalances, the massive kind of surveillance machinery that we encounter. But 25 years ago, things were slightly different, and yet you could foresee that there was these issues.
Well, 25 years ago, a lot of the threats that we see now on the internet were starting to be visible. There weren't as many organizations. There weren't aggressively combing everyone's net history and trying to slurp up people's net traffic. But you could see the start of it. You could see people actively getting their histories searched by hostile organizations that wanted to dig up something bad on them because they didn't like their politics. You could see surveillance getting used in ways that were legal but fairly objectionable a lot of the time. And one of the complicated things was that everybody was a potential actor in the surveillance as well as a subject of the surveillance. That is, it's not, when something is broadcast in public, it's not that hard to slurp all the data you can find on it and do some analysis on it. I felt that one of the things that has really kept societies working and kept societies flexible is the ability of people to compartmentalize public personas so that, when I'm sitting here today, I can be a clever 40-something guy who's done some programs about anonymity. And when I go somewhere else, I can be a guy sitting around telling bad jokes and reading science fiction and stuff. And if I'm said something incredibly stupid in my teens, ideally the world has forgotten about it. But when there's only one or two identifiers for a person, and when identifiers are easily correlated, everybody's personas just get combined into one fairly misleading profile that gives the wrong impression all the time to other people, and which is a vulnerability that people have. I think like the idea to work on anonymity in this way was sort of it was kind of naive on my part. I thought personally that we would step into this field, show everyone how to do it well, show people what they were missing, and then someone much smarter than us with better programming skills, the real experts who had already been in this field, would step in, take our ideas, and do something better, and I could go work on something else.
Here you are 25 years later.
Yeah, it turns out by the time that our ideas were accepted, people thought we were the experts. So,
well, this is a perfect transition to the next question, which is around onion routing. And so this is, directed to Paul. And I'm going to ask two parts. So, like, when did this idea come about? When did you start discussing it? And then I think there was a central paper as well that was connected to that. And so after that, so if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of the idea, the paper, and then talk a little bit about the first implementation of the protocol after that paper.
Okay. Well, so I don't know. I don't have like a date. I don't have some like magic, Watson, I need you sort of moment I can point at. But I would say it was late 95, November, December. And I think probably Mike Reed would get credit for the genesis. He was one of my colleagues at NRL. He and David Goldschlag and I were the ones who, invented onion routing together. He was positing to David, almost a challenge. He said, well, look, how can you, create a connection on the internet without the infrastructure knowing, what the destination is? That seems contrary to the protocols. And we wanted something that just worked with existing protocols, not something, completely different. And that didn't seem possible. And at the time, David was giving me rides to work. So we were carpooling and we would banter the ideas back and forth a bit. And then we would get into work and the three of us would talk. I do remember one specific memory of standing in front of a chalkboard in my office. And yes, back then it was a chalkboard. And when we had come up with the prototype sort of idea of the data structure that we were going to use for building circuits. And the idea was it was just layers of cryptography with nothing in the middle, no messages, no nothing. It was just layers. And this was why we called it onion routing, because it was a thing that was comprised of nothing but layers. That's where the idea came from. I don't remember if we, first thought, well, we've got to make our circuits bidirectional, or whether we, thought about how to, split off the identification and then thought about how to make it bidirectional. I don't remember, how all that came together. But we were working on it in the late 95, and we submitted a paper on it to the first information hiding workshop, which was in May and June of 1996 at the Newton Institute in Cambridge in the UK. actually, the first reviews that came back said, do you guys know about mixes? Which we didn't. So David Chaum had invented this earlier technology called mixes, which has some similarity, and it took us a while to realize that that it wasn't just the same. But anyway, we did the reason that we would think of now as the Silver Jubilee is because we did the first presentation May 31st, 1996. We presented the paper. And actually, you're asking was the first implementation after that? The first implementation was actually before that. We, at the same time that we presented the paper that described the design and what it was supposed to do, we also announced the first publicly accessible implementation. It was just purely proof of concept and something for us to, analyze and try to understand what we had. It was 5 nodes, but they were virtual. They were running on the same one Sun UltraSpark at NRL, and there was just a public interface where you could put in the website you wanted to visit, and then it would bounce around this network and go out there. And that was, that was available around the same time, spring of 1996. 98, I guess, we had our first, distributed network set up with some nodes at NRL, some on the West Coast, and some at, I think, University of Maryland. But yeah, the first prototype was 1996. So.
Great, thanks for that. It's a good reminder that carpooling is not only good for the environment, but innovation perhaps as well. So carpool if you can. So let's talk a little bit about the magic between Roger, Nick, and Paul, right? So the project is really coming out of a research lab connected to the government. Roger and Nick students in the MIT area, part of hacker communities. How did you all connect? And how did that connection go from, talking about this project to something more substantial?
Well, I met Roger at the first of what is now the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Symposium. You credited me with being the founder of that. I am a founder. Roger is another one. I guess maybe Andreas Fitzman's another. Adam Shostak. I'm not sure who else is on the starting it list, but I think those.
Hannes Federath.
Hannes Federath, yes, because actually Hannes was the host of this first one, which was not called PETS, but was the workshop on design issues in anonymity and unobservability. That's what it was. That's what it was originally called. But we bandied around different possible names for things. But I was there presenting one of our early attempts at formally setting out the security properties of onion routing. Which, as I said, took a while to get all worked out, but I was presenting a paper on that topic. And while I was there was this guy, Roger, who was presenting a system called Freehaven. This was, I think, effectively his master's thesis from MIT, and it was a censorship-resistant publishing system. And as Roger used to say back then, anybody who designs one of those at some point says, assume an anonymous communications infrastructure. And I said, well, funny you should say that. I've been working on one for a while, and I like what I see here, and I'd be really happy if you would come work with me on this. And I convinced him, or we convinced each other, I don't know, but we both seemed to think it was a good idea. And Roger was at a startup, Reputation Technologies at the time. He had graduated just, I guess, maybe a few months earlier or something, or a year earlier, I forget. But
more like a year.
A year earlier. So he'd been at Reputation for a year, and Nick was also there. And Roger said, "Oh, I've got this great colleague who I think would be wonderful to work on this, also." And I said, "Sure." And that was how that's how the three of us started collaborating.
So Roger and Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about your relationship together? Because I know you had already had a relationship for many years, right?
Yeah,
You want to take this one, Nick?
Sure. We met at MIT. We were at the same dorm. We did some classes together. I was not so much security and privacy focused as Roger was in my studies. I was a lot more interested in compilers and software engineering methods. And it turns out that it's actually a really good fit because at the end of the day, even when you've got a great privacy design, there's still some programming involved, and the code has to run. And it turns out that having the code still be maintainable after a decade or two can be a challenge. Yeah, so we knew each other socially, and I found myself taking a job at an internet startup that began with very high-minded purposes and very grand ambitions. I think their secret ambition was to come up with reputation services so good that they would eliminate dishonesty as a viable business practice. This clearly did not happen. And they wound up, and so at the start, when I was recruited Roger to come work with us, we thought that we would need a really high-end security person who could do analysis of multi-party adversarial systems where everybody's lying about everybody else and nobody trusts anyone else, and trying to make some sense out of that kind of thing. By the time that Roger was talking with Paul, that was no longer what we were doing at Reputation. They were instead mainly trying to do what would nowadays be called business analytics tools. So that's a much less exciting place for a security person to be, and Roger needed another source of income within Reputation because they had enough need for him to maybe have need for, like, what would you say, like a third of your time, but not a lot more. And also, it wasn't really fulfilling at that point.
Yeah, there's actually more connection there than there might at first seem, because when you're thinking of reputation systems and you're thinking of identities and you're thinking of pseudonyms and you're thinking of multiple entities trying to pretend to be different people, and suddenly privacy and identities and anonymity are all kind of overlapping topics there. But yeah, in terms of the connection to Paul, I met Paul in summer of 2000 at this first PETS conference that wasn't called PETS. And a while after that, I remember at Information Hiding 2001, I was talking to Andreas Fitzman and saying, that conference was great. Somebody should, and you know that phrase, somebody should. So right. Andreas turned to me at that point and said, you will never have more free time than you have right now. You should do it.
I remember that conversation. So.
And I was thinking, well, I'm just I just graduated from college. What do you mean I should run this academic conference? So that was a great opportunity for Paul and me to team up on making the second PETS happen in 2002. And also around 2001, Paul got some funding to do some more onion routing research, and he wanted to fund me to do that. And I said, but I have this startup. How about you fund the startup? And that turned out to be very wise, because our startup had no other sources of funding that year. So that NRL research money was the only item on that side of the books, which when they realized they didn't have any money and they were thinking about layoffs, you can't lay off the only person who is bringing in any money. So, and then later there was more funding, so I could quit. And then later there was even more funding, so I could get Nick on as a subcontractor from there.
So a quick question. At this period, around 2000, mm-hmm. Paul, are you working on this issue full time? And then are you working on mailing lists and chat rooms? Are you drawing in other volunteers at this point? Is there a kind of an identity as a project, or is it still more just we're trying to get this kind of protocol off the ground? So there's that aspect. And then when does it really start to kind of form in a more substantial way as a standalone project, and also as a technology where you're like, oh wow, this is really kind of starting to be feasible, right? As infrastructure.
Well, yeah, that feels like a lot more subtle question than you probably intended, because on the one hand, I feel like we thought we might have had something at NRL before Roger and Nick even came on the scene, and there was a fair evolution of the design from the very first version we had was very much more peer-to-peer. The same thing that created the circuits was also doing routing, and one of the first changes we made was that was fine if what you were trying to protect was communication starting in some naval enclave and going out. But we also wanted to protect individuals who might not be in a position to run part of the routing. So we separated that out. And then we also knew there was a system back then called crowds that worked by, you would have this crowd, and members of the crowd you would forward to a random member, which would flip a weighted coin. And if it came up tails, they would forward to another member. And then when the coin finally came up heads, then it would exit to where you wanted to go. And I happen to know from some people who participated in these crowds that I didn't want to be responsible for sending other people's traffic out into wherever. So I just reset my probability of forwarding to 1. So rather than have people hack that, we made this a conscious design choice. And we said, okay, if you just want to be a router, that's fine. If you want to set an exit policy where you can exit to these destinations and these ports, you could do that. So we were definitely moving along and making progress, and we had a fair amount of research going. But then kind of everybody who was involved in this at the NRL and the contractors who were in NRL basically left except for me. And it was right, our funding had kind of ended for that. And I thought this was a really great thing, but as usual, you're not sure what's going to happen. And I did get some funding to basically, keep it, make it better. And the first thing that I actually had brought Roger and Nick on to do was essentially to sort of clean up and make the existing code base a bit better. It was very crufty, and here Nick's programming expertise played a big role, because they quickly said, look, what would be much better than fixing this mess would be to just do a basic redesign, and that was the genesis essentially of the design that became Tor.
Yeah, back then, a lot of it was about writing research papers, not about writing software or having a free software project. It was about figuring out what this thing should do and why it would be safe if it did it that way.
Yeah, I was when we started, we did our work not based on the NRL code, but based on PhD research code from a researcher called Mate Pfeiffer.
Actually, that was an undergraduate research code, no less.
Yes, undergraduate research code. And it would run and it would sort of do onion routing, which was honestly better than some of the research code that I've seen in the past. And there were still vague remnants of that design in Tor's code base. Another thing about those early days and the emergence of sort of Tor as an important thing, or at the same time, like Roger and I were working on a high latency anonymity system called MixMinion. And MixMinion was an attempt to fix a lot of the flaws that existed back then in the anonymous remailer world with the Cypherpunks remailer and the Mixmaster remailer. These days, MixMinion is dead, and the remailer world in general is not what it was. But a lot of our early community and people who were interested in working on these problems with us and who were interested in talking about these things with us were people who came out of the Mixnets and anonymous remailers world. I remember there was a community of remailer operators who were really full of good advice on deployments, on thinking through usability problems, on getting users, on getting people willing to run the software, and who were enthusiastic early relay operators. One of the things that actually made me realize that Tor was the way that things were going to go and not MixMinion was at some point a few years in, I realized, like, hang on, I use Tor every day, and I can't think of the last time I've sent or received a Mixminion message. Um, Clearly, one of these is more useful than the other.
So let's talk a little bit about the point where Tor becomes a free software project. You know, what lay behind that decision, and was that something that you envisioned more like, okay, we'll make it free software at a legal level, and or were you also interested in creating a kind of open source project, because they were definitely taking off at the time? You know, things like Debian and the Linux kernel were thriving communities.
Roger and I were definitely free software and open source enthusiasts, advocates, and possibly zealots at the time, and continue to be so at a certain polite level of zealotry. I think we wanted Tor to be free and widely available. That was, to a certain extent, a process of deliberation and negotiation, because it really did serve everyone's interests, not just ours, because we wanted to be an open project with an open community, providing free software, but it's also served NRL's interests pretty well to have a research platform that all the researchers in the world could use, and that researchers could extend and build papers off of, and so forth.
Oh,
And the
was it
third
hard?
reason,
Oh, go ahead.
the third reason why having it be free software is really important is the users need to be able to look at it and trust it. As a security tool, you need a diverse set of communities using it, and you need each of them to be able to assess for themselves whether it's a thing that they want to participate in. And as an anonymity likes company style design, you need the companies and the individuals and the governments and the activists and so on all using it together. So it has to be free and open, or it'll never work.
Right. And I was going to actually say, I mean, I agree with everything that both Nick and Roger said, but this was another element that in many, you know, it predated Tor, because, you know, right at the very beginning, we argued, look, if we make this thing, if it's a Navy-only system or a U.S. government-only system, we can protect, you know, which particular, you know, command is maybe doing something, but anything going in will be going to the Navy. Anything coming out is coming from the Navy, and you will get no better protection than you get from, say, a VPN. And so you need to carry traffic for diversely trusting users, the kind of people who wouldn't be running on a government network. And so you need to, and they're not going to just trust your network, so you have to let them run part of the infrastructure. And similarly, if they're going to run things, you can't just hand them a blob of code and say, here's this code, trust us, it's great. Like Roger said, you want them to be able to validate it and be able to make sure that it's it's doing what they want it to do. Now, Tor has gone very far beyond our initial vision. Back then, we did get our first publication release for code was also in 1996. So we were, you know, open source essentially from the beginning, but Tor has gone on, and besides having all these very detailed specifications that Nick has talked about, and encouraged researchers to pound on the thing and to be very open about whatever they find and reveal it. But it also does things like deterministic builds, so you can be sure that the source code and the running binaries match each other. So again, you know, making it transparent and trustable as possible for everyone was very important, but was actually fundamental to the design. Onion routing wouldn't provide the security you want without that.
Yeah, I think that we hoped that many of the alleged benefits of open source that were widely touted at the time, we hope that all of them would materialize for us. Not all of them did, as we were led to believe. Recruitment of developers has always been somewhat slow. I think in part because it's a actually difficult problem area. I think in part because everybody has their own projects to work on. Let's see. But I think in general it was a wise decision. There were some interesting. It was interesting how it actually moved away from being a get a release for every release we want to do, and into just no, there's standing permission to just put this in a public CVS repository. But maybe that's a story for another time.
Yeah, so I wanted to double down on some of these strong arguments for being open, and we're still the world is still struggling with understanding the value of free software and openness in that way, and how to think about these things in the security context. Like a few years, like 2005, at a hacker conference in the Netherlands called What the Hack, I ended up doing 3 Tor talks in 3 days, so I had a lot of chances to answer questions from the thousands of hackers who were there. And one of the common questions was, how do we know if we can trust this thing? Why should we be able to trust this? And the correct answer is, you don't have to trust me. Here's the source code. Here are the specs. Here's the documentation. Here are the research papers. You can look at it for yourself. You can assess whether you should trust it. And they heard, maybe you shouldn't trust it, when I said that. And I got to try a second answer, because enough people asked me that question. And the second answer was, no, dude, don't worry about it. It's fine. And that shouldn't have worked. But that worked great because of the community trust angle, where there I am as an invited speaker, and I seem to know what I'm talking about, and I seem to be one of them. So there's some complexity here in terms of how the world views trust and how free software plays into that.
Yeah, I remember early on that the early code, because we were working on it, and we wanted to be as upfront as possible about what it did and what it didn't. And I may not have this verbatim, but when it started up, it said something like, "This is experimental software. Do not use if you care about strong anonymity protections." And so that was an attempt to be truthful. But meanwhile, there was much lesser awful stuff out there commercially available, with pictures of metal plates with rivets in it and locks, and using phrases like rock solid. And if you could use this thing that says rock solid and it's got pictures of metal plating on it, or you could use this thing that says experimental, we don't know, what do you do? So it was strange that the right thing to do was actually to, not be dishonest, but to scale back on your attempt to, be scientific and talk about all the possible things that might go wrong, when you realize actually you're the best game in town.
Right.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that warning message. I became completely convinced when I was reading a journalist article saying, the Tor people don't recommend that you use their thing yet. Instead, you should use one of these snake oil, single hot proxy proprietary corporate things. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Paul, did you mention the year that was, more or less? Like where you had the warning and it was still better than what was out there?
Mid-2000s.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was it was within the first 3-4 years, I would say. So somewhere between 2004 and 2008, I think. Yeah, maybe even sooner. The first release of Tor was 2002, 2003 was there was maybe was it 1350 node network up by 2003. So yeah, I don't remember exactly when, but it would have been mid-2000s.
So I have 2 sets of questions, are kind of a bit different, but I'll just relay them at the same time. So as Tor became a free software project, and obviously from the beginning there was a lot of researchers and research around the technology, but as you had more both developers and people who are also contributing to the kind of larger infrastructure, what changed technically about Tor, if at all, or was it sort of like we're just on a trajectory, it's just improving, right? Because we're getting more labor power, or was there something about the addition of individuals who were part of this project who kind of shifted the nature of the project? So I'll wait to ask my second question, because that's a big question.
I've
Well-
got an answer. I can, but if Paul, you want to jump in first?
Well, I was just going to say, so, I mean, I already talked about some of the changes we made, in the evolution of onion routing before Tor. Actually, I always think of Tor as third generation, but we had this paper where we called it second generation, which always confuses
Sorry.
me. I would say the biggest innovation, there were many, but from Tor versus the previous versions was, I already talked about this data structure, this onion that we used to build the circuits. Tor didn't use that, and when you use the onion, there was a key that was in each layer, and you were giving to each onion router this key. And what that meant, if the public keys were later broken, you could basically learn everything. And so there's this crypto thing called Diffie-Hellman that allows you to basically set up a key without actually sending it. And there was a guy named Zach Brown who wrote an onion routing system he called Cibola. And
Saboya.
pardon?
Saboya.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, my Spanish is so excellent. But yes. Anyway, he had this idea of telescoping through an existing circuit and doing the Diffie-Hellman with the next one, and that got you this forward secrecy property. And that was a major difference. Besides having much better code, this was a major difference between Tor and the previous versions of onion routing.
I'll answer that from a different angle, which is the Tor project grew as an umbrella of a bunch of different projects. So, for example, if you read the 2004 Usenix security research paper, there's a section saying you'd better figure out your application privacy on your own. Browsers are complicated. Good luck.
Yeah.
And once we got users, then we realized that our users were not figuring out the browser side on their own. It wasn't working, and that's where they were getting screwed. So at that point, I think Mike Perry showed up and said, I'm going to make this Tor button thing actually make your browser safe. And before we knew it, now a browser was part of the Tor ecosystem. And then we needed a GUI, and then we needed metrics, and then we needed measurement tools, and then we needed other, and it became an umbrella of different projects. And that's always been one of its strengths, because there are so many different pieces of Tor, but it's also a challenge because there are so many different pieces.
To me, the key inflection point was our focus on utility. Not necessarily usability, because we were never all that good at usability in the early days, but we sort of looked at the design space as a triangle of you can be very, very secure and we looked at, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. One way to look at it was to say we want to maximize security, and subject to maximizing security, we want to see how much usefulness we can get. But the approach we took was more, we want to specify a required level of usefulness, and subject to that, maximize security. And once you make that choice, that forces you in a onion routing style direction rather than a mixed net style direction, because you're saying, well, we have to be useful for web browsing.
Yeah, that was. I'm sorry.
But that same principle really carried us to say, well, no, we need to deploy this, and we need to make it so that you can use it with your web browser. So, and just regular people can. So we can't use any kernel extensions. We can't use any drop-in TCP replacements. What can we use? I guess we're going to need to use a SOCKS proxy, because that was the kind of proxy that seemed like it could actually be useful at the time. And following that kind of line of reasoning, where we're like, saying, well, we actually need to get this in front of users today, and that was like actually a strategic thing that we did for political reasons as well. But just once you start saying we need to get this in front of users today, you start finding out where the gaps in all of the research are, where the problems are that no one had anticipated, what solutions are adequate, what solutions are not adequate, what brilliant designs you've come up with that solve a problem no one has, and what problems you have a paragraph about in a tiny paper that are actually like
Huge.
grand foundational issues for the whole field. And you never find out any of that until you actually put the software in front of humans. So I guess that'd be my advice to anybody who's like in a similar position trying to solve problems today, is just deploy early before you figure out all the answers, because the problems aren't even what you think they are.
Yeah, I would say, just to underscore that, the usefulness point that Nick was raising, we also had a design decision early on with onion routing that we wanted this to work, so that a website that you were visiting via onion routing doesn't have to know about onion routing at all. You don't need, they don't need to specially configure something. They should, as far as they know, they're just getting a TCP connection, and that was a fundamental idea. And yes, there were a lot of trade-offs there. And I remember what we call the onion dinner. There was a bunch of Berkeley area cypherpunks that when we had a paper at the Oakland conference in 1997, they hosted us. And I remember them asking all these questions, but you're vulnerable to this and vulnerable to that. And we said, yes, and that's true. And we need to spell this out and we need to figure it out, but we don't want to build a secure brick. We want something that is going to actually work.
And EFF pushed us along that way, because one of the first things that they said when they started funding us was, you need a Windows installer. And then we had Windows users. And then we had exit abuse. Before the Windows installer, everybody was an exit relay because all the users were nice. And then everything got larger and bigger and more real world, and here we are.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating because on the one hand, it's important to, have very strong design principles and conceptual foundations, but then at a certain point, independent of use, right? Really building a usable tool requires that use, right? And things will only become clear at that point. And so in some ways, I had asked the question about what happens when you have more developers and participants in the project, but really the answer is about what happens when people actually start using the technology, right?
Yeah, I remember when we first, when I was still working on this, and I mean, I did want it deployed and I cared that it worked properly and be, protect people, but I was still viewing things, from the perspective of kind of, academic researcher sort of view. And I remember meeting Patrick Ball somewhere at a meeting, and I told him I was working on this thing, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting. I might be able to use that." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I go into certain countries where when the secret police show up and confiscate your laptop, then all your friends disappear. And so I'm looking for things that will help me." And I remember that was mid 90s, maybe 97 or 98. But I thought, okay, we have to make this work well. We can't mess around. This isn't just academic. This really has to work.
No, exactly. And Patrick Ball is the perfect person to know that. And he's often interfaced with the kind of hacker community over this very question. So like the corollary question I had to the one I just asked has to do much more with social organization, right? So obviously Tor is an academic project, it's a free software project, it's a technical project, it's a hacker project, but it's also an organization, and good organizations make good technology. So can you talk a little bit, all of you, about the evolution of Tor? I mean, it's a free software project. It also got funding from the EFF. I have come to understand that you were thinking about turning Tor into a consulting company, a Red Hat style. In the end, you settled on a kind of nonprofits, free software hybrid. So can we talk a little bit about the evolution of the kind of institutional face of Tor, why that matters, and some of the kind of challenges and lessons from that history?
Sure. Well, I mean, the simplest, at the start when it was just me and Roger, then getting paid for it, the legal structure was simple. Roger was doing business as Moria Research Labs, and I was contracting for Roger, and he was contracting to some chain of things that eventually led to Paul. We continued that when for a while there wasn't NRL funding, because research funding is a very what's the word I want to use? High variance and
Inconsistent.
inconsistent funding source that you almost need a full-time person to like smooth it out. So the AFF wanted to carry us over for a year until we could find, until either they could get more donations for us, or until we could find something better. I think that we weren't sure which way that was going to go, but we kept the same structure. After a while, though, EFF found out that their existing fundraising stuff, although it was great for the kind of advocacy work they do, wasn't turning into donations for the kind of software development that we do. So we were without funding for a bit, and we needed to. We realized pretty early on that like if we wanted to keep doing this as our full-time jobs, which we did, in addition to like doing this as a fun hobby in our spare time, we would need to incorporate somehow or have some kind of corporate structure, largely for mundane tax reasons. Like if you are a corporation, you can like receive money and pay money and avoid double taxing on it if you happen to be holding any money at the end of the year. Whereas our previous tax mitigation strategy was split the money right away and don't have a bank balance as Tor, which obviously isn't going to work if you're scaling up to more people, which we needed to do. Roger, you want to tell the story about how we decided not to go for profit?
Yeah, so EFF was hoping to fund us for 2 years, and they turned out to only be able to fund us for 1 year, which made the second year exciting, because then we were trying to figure out what's next. And one of the models that was succeeding at the time was the Red Hat one, where you have a bunch of free software and you have a bunch of users and you have people who want to be able to use it well, including companies and so on. So maybe there's some way to get some people to pay us to make Tor better, or to pay us to help them use Tor better, or something like that. And that it's probably good that we didn't go that route. While we were pondering that sort of thing, I ended up going to, they were called IBB at the time, International Broadcasting Bureau. Now they're called BBG, or they even have, basically it's the Voice of America folks in the US government. They keep changing their name every couple of years. And I had a meeting with them because they have some websites that some folks in the world want to be able to reach, and some countries in the world try to block. And that connection was actually made by Simpson Garfinkel, Small World in academia. And they thought we were interesting because before that, their main technique for helping people get to their website was to spam email with single proxy addresses and hope that the censors didn't learn those proxy addresses and block them. And Tor at the time was about privacy, not about censorship circumvention, but you could use it directly in China and Iran and Russia and other places, because if they block a certain website, but they don't block Tor, then you're done. You just use Tor to get to the website and everything works. So that was the beginning of the censorship circumvention side of things. And they funded us a little bit. And then they were amazed that we actually did things with their money. And then they funded us some more. And then we decided to do the 501c3 nonprofit side of things. Another piece that pushed us towards the 501c3 nonprofit side of things, I remember I think it was 2006, PETS and another academic conference, WISE, Workshop on Economics of Information Security, were co-hosted in Cambridge, England. And I was doing a talk on why usable privacy software is a security property, because if it's not usable, then it won't actually keep you safe. And Bruce Schneier was in the audience, and he's like, that guy, what he said, it's true. Let's find a way to give him some funding. And Omidyar had asked Bruce to find people doing worthwhile things. So Bruce hooked us up with Omidyar. And then Omidyar was like, here's your 40K seed grant. Tell me about your 501c3. And I'm like, 50 what? And at that point, EFF became our fiscal sponsor, and we learned a lot more about how nonprofits work, and eventually became one of our own.
Yeah. I think what eventually decided us, or at least moved me towards wanting to be a nonprofit, was generally realizing, like, it's incredibly difficult to actually do what we're trying to do. It's incredibly difficult to try to make the internet a better place by providing privacy tools that can be popular and widely used and that are going to survive after, you know, the people who invented them are no longer working on them. And that's enough of a challenge without, like, actually trying to make it something that rewards investors and gets everybody rich as well. You know, it is strictly harder to get rich changing the world than it is to change the world.
And if we had shareholders pushing on us, a lot of for-profit privacy companies end up doing evil things, and I'm glad we don't have that push.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we were for profit now, we'd probably be out of business by now, or doing something with no resemblance to Tor.
Yeah. No, it's hard to imagine that it could be that structure, and yet, you know, it's also so hard to find the funding in order to sustain a project like this, because you need time, right? I mean, Tor is a remarkable, has, you know, the architecture is really strong. There's this huge research community, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. But you need the time to build it out, maintain it, change it, iterate it, and that, you know, requires salaries and these sorts of things, right? And that is one of the biggest challenges, I think, to making privacy enhancing tools out in the world. It's just simply the monetary institutional aspects, which is a little bit why I wanted to talk about that. But as a corollary to that, I want to talk about, like, computer scientists and professors who also contribute to the Tor community through their research. Is this a pretty vibrant community? Does it happen organically, where you just have professors who are kind of interested in it? Is this something that you worry about in terms of, will there be computer scientists in the future working on this, because so many are going into machine learning and AI? So can we talk a little bit about the research community that comes out of academia?
One thing is that something you said earlier on reminded me of this too, about the trickiness of making something that's usable, and that actually makes it have, in many ways, it's a real interesting problem. I guess I won't name names, but I was talking to somebody who is, one of, the names in computer networking, very senior person. And I remember telling her, we were talking about how we could make onion routes maybe more efficient. And she would suggest this or that. And I said, oh yeah, but if we do that, then you're undermining, you're hiding this from this kind of adversary. And if you try to do that, and she had all these suggestions. And then after a little bit, she said, oh, that is a hard problem. And then I felt validated that these very smart people, their standard tools weren't going to do it. I alluded to this a little bit earlier when I talked about all the Tor proposals and and all the things that Tor does to be well documented and stuff. Because I think a lot of times there's researchers who say, oh, here's an interesting tool. I'd like to see if this is any good or what the problems might be. And oftentimes they have to, reverse engineer some dissertationware that doesn't actually run. And here it's set up so that they are encouraged, and it's actually help, and there's the Tor metrics portal that gives them huge amounts of data that they can look at. And so they have an ability to actually apply their skills. So there's been a lot of effort to make something that not only works and is useful for people, but is also amenable to the kinds of things that the computer science professors do.
And we've spent years and decades now interacting with the computer security research world and going to the main conferences. And I stand around in my bright green Tor shirt, and the grad students come up to me and I chat with them about open research questions on Tor. So it's not something that just happens by default. You need to do the preparations that Paul described, where you make your whole ecosystem amenable to research. But you also have to build the relationships with the professors and help them get the funding to pay the grad students to be able to focus on these things.
Yes. One of the trickiest things to learn that I've had to learn about working with researchers is that in terms of finding new attacks and new vulnerabilities, they can pretty much move forward with that pretty well. But there's some classes of attacks that only come out of like more hacker style security research, and nearly anything that does cross application based stuff is going to come out of a hacker based security world. The second thing is, in terms of defenses, good defenses almost always come out collaboratively between developers and researchers for a system of Tor's maturity. Like, we have to actually work with the researchers for a few iterations of saying, but you can't actually build that because of this issue. You can't build that because you're making an assumption here that isn't true. All right, what if we assume that everyone doesn't upgrade on the same day? Okay, what if we assume that everyone doesn't have perfectly synchronized clocks? Okay, but what if you have to actually make it work on Windows? And so on. But I think that that's actually good for everyone in a lot of ways. It helps researchers think about, I mean, some people just aren't interested in applications, and that's fine. But for researchers who are interested in having their work turn into applied work or having their work actually get built, that's a powerful incentive.
No, exactly. And, as a outsider insider who has participated in various community meetings, it's just so fascinating to see different types of technologists and researchers with very different backgrounds, very academic, very hackerish, some with an activist orientation, some without it, come together and, work through these problems. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why Tor is the way it is, right? And it's a very kind of special and unique project in that way as well. So I think we have maybe about 15 or so minutes left. And I think we'll end on the question of the future, even though this has been mostly about the past. So this is the question. Do you believe there are other solutions that could replace the onion routing design in the future? Any promising technology that you're excited about?
I'll go. So first of all, any prediction that you make will, almost certainly turn out to be false in interesting and typically amusing ways. So I'm hesitant to say. One thing, there are lots of proposals and designs out there. A lot of them are actually taking something like onion routing and pushing it deeper into the infrastructure of the internet, which would require, essentially rewriting chunks of the internet. And, if that were to happen, then I think a lot of what, onion routing and Tor is doing would of course, at least very much change, if not just go away. But I think that partly for the reasons we've said, but just in general, this, sort of living on top of the existing internet protocols and working with them and being backwards compatible with things as they exist, even as you try to create new things, is really important. And since you're asking, maybe isn't far in the future, but something I've been working on for the last several years that I'm kind of excited about is what I call self-authenticating traditional addresses. And this is kind of combining onion addresses, which look like a random string, but have the nice advantage that they're self-authenticating and they build security essentially into the fabric of the web. When you have a hyperlink, the cryptographic identity, the key that validates that is built into the address, but it doesn't look like a regular URL, and you have to use Tor browser. And so what we've been looking at is combining these with ordinary domain names that people understand. And then if you're going over Tor browser, it will work and you'll get all of Tor browser's protections of lookup and routing to an onion service. But if you're using, say, Firefox, and you're not routing over Tor, but you have the extensions we've created, then you get the self-authentication protection. So you're no longer subject to certificate hijack, which is a major threat. And then if you don't have any of that and you don't know anything, well, the website will still just work. You don't have to know anything special. It will just work, assuming there's no attacks. But you can just use the less secure web, as I call it, that exists out there. So, and then on the server side, the web server doesn't, right now, if entities like Facebook or the New York Times or the CIA or all other entities who've set up onion services, they have to create a separate onion service with links that go to the URLs that are on that. Here you can just have one that will work either way. And so I guess yes, I'm very excited about that, but the broader lesson might be that maintaining things that allow you to move forwards without cutting yourself off, and if anything, expanding so that others who hadn't been maybe accessing your stuff now can. And then ultimately, I think they should, of course, migrate to using something like Tor browser so that they're getting those additional protections. But that's a way to expand the community.
Great. I mean, how realistic is this? I mean, is this like it's in motion?
Well, I've got at least one research paper published, and we have, software. I mean, we have, again, prototypes. It's not like, it's in wide deployment. It's not as mature as Tor, but it's as mature as Tor was in the early days.
Okay.
So
great. So Roger, Nick, some thoughts around this as well?
Well, generally, I think like if we're looking at general purpose privacy tools, I think that whatever people are using in 20 or 30 years is going to be built substantially differently from today's Tor, and is likely to have lots of differences from today's Tor. And what remains to be seen is whether it is a future version of Tor or whether it's something else. I think that a lot of the space for technical innovation kind of falls into two areas. One of them is kind of within the onion routing paradigm, where you're trying to solve the same kinds of problems. That is, you're trying to solve users on general purpose computers trying to access the general purpose internet for everything from email to video conferencing. And I don't think that's going to get too far away from where onion routing is now. I think we're going to keep doing evolution on this kind of design. I think the area where we are likely to see substantially different designs that don't look like onion routing, if we do, is for domain-specific privacy applications. If you're only worried about chat, for instance, you can make stuff that is in some ways far more clunky than Tor to use, but works well enough for chat and might get you better privacy for chat. Of course, what remains to be, and similar things are possible in other application domains or with other assumptions. Like if you assume that everyone has an always-on internet connection that never turns off, that also puts you in a different design space that lets you get some desirable privacy properties. But of course, when you talk about that kind of theoretical improvement, it comes back to the question of usability and usefulness. If it turns out that, say, millions and millions of people would be willing to use a chat application that provides you privacy at the expense of not being able to send images and having a 5-second message delay, that's a very different world from one where the user base for something like that tops out at 5,000 or 50,000 users. In the first case, you could see a real improvement in private chat. In the second case, it's not really in anyone's interest to build a tool with a user base that small for privacy purposes. Roger?
Yeah, so I'll try to tackle this from a different angle. You were asking about alternatives to Tor or something like that. So Tor, in a sense, is an approach to writing privacy software. It originally was a program called Tor, and then it became this ecosystem umbrella that I was talking about. And for example, long ago, we met this great guy named Nathan Freitas, and he was doing Android Tor, and he was doing Android other things, and then we learned, wait a minute, you value users, you value security, you value honesty, you value transparency. You're a Tor person. And he started off with, wait, what do you? Okay, sure, and then later we were talking to the UNI folks, Open Observatory for Network Interference, and we were like, yeah, so openness of data sets and measuring transparency, you're Tor people. And that's how the Tor umbrella grows, where we find people who share the same values as us and want the same destination, and then there are more Tor people. So in some sense, a lot of the alternatives to that Tor model are people who don't value the openness or have other priorities than us. So that was that. I mean, so that's how we grow, and that's what the alternatives do. If you are working on a thing that shares values with us, you are us. Join us. And then I guess in terms of other problems that we need solved. One of the big challenges that we've learned about over the past 10 years or something, the internet is not as distributed and decentralized as we thought. There's Deutsche Telekom and AT&T and a couple of others, and they run the pipes. And then there's Gmail and Facebook and a couple of others, and they run the walled gardens. And then there's Akamai and Cloudflare and a couple of others, and they host the web. So it used to be that there was this huge decentralized internet, and you can bounce your traffic around it, and you get privacy out of that. So in the future, we're going to need something that understands that Facebook is where all the people are talking, and it can't just be about, do I let you reach Facebook safely? It has to be something about that platform itself. And it can't just be, do I let you reach Cloudflare safely? Because then Cloudflare gets to see everything that everybody does on all of their websites. And it can't just be, do I let you have metadata protection when you're sending your traffic over this internet connection that all the telephone companies in the world have bought access to surveil. So this tendency towards centralization is a risk for the world. And we, the world, need solutions.
Well, I think that's a good place to end for various reasons. And I am going to thank everyone in a moment, but I do actually want to note something based on what everyone just talked about, and also combine it with the fact that we are celebrating, a kind of 25th anniversary, right? I mean, this is a really big deal. Everyone who's on the screen and others who are involved in Tor should feel very proud for what they've been able to do. And I think, there's various lessons that have come out of this conversation. And one really important one is that, we live in a society that often values like the next new thing and encourages individuals to change from one thing to the next. And change institutions and projects. And, that's okay. But it's also okay to stick with a project for a very long time, right? To stick with something that you believe in and work collectively over time. And I think Tor has done that. And the fact that here we have 3 individuals who were there from the start, really from the start, Paul and Roger and Nick, is testament to that. And so obviously, again, we're here celebrating the fact that Tor has been around. But again, I think this is a broader lesson for other projects, whether they're technical or non-technical. So that's definitely one big thing. The other one, too, is what Roger just talked about, which is kind of about coalition building at some level, right? So on the one hand, obviously, Tor is a concept. It's a suite of technologies. It does, it works within one domain around anonymity, security, and censorship, right? But they're allied projects that are able to work well and complement the project. And sometimes it's better to bring them on board, right? And that there's kind of strength in numbers when it comes to anonymity, but also projects as well. And I think that's another lesson behind Tor. And then finally, and this is a little bit related too, is that the project brings together different types of people, hackers and researchers and activists, users, and people also from different parts of the world. And I think Isabella, our current ED, has been really marvelous in this way as well. And that's a different type of diversity that has helped with this project. So I just wanted to note those things that I think they really came out in the conversation. And to finish, I will thank Paul, Nick, and Roger, but also just turn it over to each one of you for like one final word or thoughts to end this conversation.
Well, when you were saying all that, I was thinking that, back in, I don't remember, maybe 90s, might have been pre-Tor, maybe not. Somebody asked, well, why are you working on all this? And I could have said, well, I truthfully, that this is very interesting and I really like it and it's important. But I thought I was being facetious when I said, but one of the really great things about this is that I've been working on creating something where people who think that they should hate each other are forced to work together to collectively create something. And I kind of thought I was joking, but in hindsight, I actually think that's one of the great virtues of this thing. So I'd like to leave it there.
Great, thank you. Roger, Nick?
So one of the earliest questions I faced when working on Tor was the question of when to release it. Back in that state when we talked about when we considered it experimental software that you shouldn't use for real purposes. And like whether we should release it now or whether we should like figure out all of the problems first and solve all of the issues first. Fortunately, we decided to release it because, as I said, you can't actually tell what the problems are until you've got users. But one of the things that decided me to release at the time wasn't that. It was the idea of holding a place in the public conscious and in the policy consciousness of saying, of making sure that when people were talking about privacy tools on the internet, in order to make their decisions about what good or bad would come of them, that they weren't working from fear and they weren't working from overconfidence, that they were actually going from experience of saying, well, look, we built this privacy tool and civilization hasn't ended. And it does have the following users. People actually do have positive uses for privacy. And I think that's one of the things that I find most rewarding about having worked on this so long. Like, okay, in addition to getting to work with all kinds of great people and learn all kinds of great things, it's realizing that privacy really does have lots of people who rely on it for reasons that I never would have guessed when I was in my early 20s. And there's so many great perspectives on privacy that, you know, are just inherent to how I think about privacy now, but have come from people that I never would have met if I hadn't started working on privacy in the first place.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Roger?
I'll double down on what Nick and Paul were just saying. There are a lot of people out there in the world who have freedoms and control over their information in part because of tools like Tor. So we're enabling people to have better, safer lives around the world, and that's a really important part of why we're doing this. And please join us and help us do that, whether that's working on Tor or working on the broader Tor ecosystem or the technologies and projects that work towards freedoms. Join us.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. I hope everyone celebrates with an onion cake or something like that. And until next time, I hope everyone out on the internet is doing well and keeping safe. And there'll be more of these, so tune in the future. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Biela.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.